Hello and welcome to the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast with me, Clive Barber, and my good mate, Noel Tom. For the days when you can't ride your bike, there's always the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast. All right, Tampers, me and Noel are very excited about this one. We are going to talk to Ed Gill, who is one of the co-founders and co-creators of the Trans-Morocco Trail. This was a great chat with Ed. It's always good to talk to somebody who's a lot smarter than you, happens to Noel a lot. Ed has been working very closely with the very famous Chris Scott to create the trail. Chris Scott, if you don't know him, was the author of the Adventure Motorcycling Handbook that first came out in 1999, and it is a seminal book for motorcycle travel and adventure. The Trans-Morocco Trail is 3,000 kilometres through some of the most astonishing parts of Morocco. Ed is a great talker. I think you're going to enjoy this one.
Noel, have we been in touch on Instagram before?
This is the nightmare of Instagram, isn't it? Because probably, Ed, we've probably had long, deep and meaningful conversations deep into the night.
Don't worry, we haven't had that.
But you've probably got some ridiculous moniker name on Instagram.
My moniker, I guess, was Where Next Barney. And the reason is because I had my first bike that I started doing adventure travel on was a Bonneville, believe it or not, before I started getting into something a little bit more off-roady. His name was Barney. I called a blog for Where Next Barney. I may be getting you confused with someone else. But you're not, are you in the lakes?
Yes.
Are you riding a Honda, an older Honda?
Yes.
Right, we have been in touch. Just a few messages back and forth, I think that's all. I must admit, I've taken a bit of a step back from Insta because I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Instagram. I find I'm very easily distracted as a person. If I was to say I get the best out of my day by having Instagram, certainly having the app on my phone, I would say that's probably not true. So I'm doing a lot less now. I do think it's for the better, actually, I must say. When I've been travelling, I don't know how you guys find when you're travelling on a bike. Travellers who have a natural relationship with social media, I kind of envy them to some respect. I struggle with it. I struggle having a balance. I struggle because my focus shifts too much. And therefore, I can never be one of these guys who uses social media to travel in perpetuity because I'd struggle with it, I think, for that reason.
Every now and again, I buy a camera thinking, right, I'm going to take some amazing pictures when we're travelling, or I'm going to make a film, I'm going to make my own film when we travel, and then I just can't be asked to take the camera out the bag most of the time.
What I have done is start doing latergrams. I'll post, that evening or later on, or in the case of Algeria, I think I posted a big post like 3 or 4 weeks later when I was on a boat home or something along those lines.
I enjoy the creativity of it, but Clive pretty much just holds his camera up. If he's reading the paper, he'll just keep reading the paper, hold his camera up, flick the shutter and take a picture and post that on Instagram.
If ever I get a good picture, it's completely by accident.
I'm told I don't take enough pictures of myself, which I did an interview with an adventure bike rider about this. And James Oxley was asking me for a photo of myself. I was like, oh. I only had these kind of grainy ones that are taken when I'd certain points in the trip when I was particularly proud of achieving something, or whatever, or a silly photo of a person, usually with a gun somewhere just for novelty, which you can take a judgment on if you like.
Me, on the other hand, rubbish behind the camera, fantastic in front of a camera.
Sometimes people's expectations have quite a wide range of expectations, I think. So on the TMT, and I don't know if you've got it from looking at the website from the FAQs, Chris and I have deliberately tried to manage people's expectations. So we've gone in with an emphasis on individual responsibility. We've gone in and saying, only you can decide whether this is right for you. And it's not a kind of like, fuck you, we don't care. It's a kind of like, it's a principle which I think both, certainly when I spoke to Chris about it, and I know, and I feel, and I think probably a lot of people feel that if adventure, a core principle of adventure motorbiking should be that sense of individual responsibility, because only you know your capabilities, your bike, your appetite for risk, your skills, and so on. Is try not to handhold too much for that reason. Now, your natural response to that would be, and quite reasonably be, well, that means that you're kind of not making it as accessible as possible. And to which I would argue, should riding off-road and remote parts of Morocco be as accessible as possible? Should it be the place where you learn from scratch to ride off-road? For me, I'm stupid enough to chuck myself in the deep end, and as I have done on multiple occasions. That's my decision. But I think being upfront from the risks of that is probably a responsible approach.
Can I just say, dear listener, if this bit stays in? The answer is no, you shouldn't go and learn to ride in Morocco. You should go and learn to ride in some lanes near your house, and then maybe go to Morocco at some point. You should go to Morocco, it's amazing.
It's beautiful, yeah.
We've both been, haven't we, Noel? I've done it the easy way. I've got a friend who owns a business out there. For about 5 or 6 years, I was invited out on the birthday rides. We're very happy to welcome Ed Gill, who is one of a team of 2 people who have created the Trans-Morocco Trail. The other person being Chris Scott, the famous Chris Scott, him of books going back as far as 1991, and we'll talk about Chris in a minute as well. Ed, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your riding history, some of the trips you've done, because you're very well travelled on motorcycles by the look of things.
Thanks, Clive, and very glad to be here. Thanks for taking the time to speak to me. So I got into bike riding, adventure bike riding. I don't know if my first trip classes adventure bike riding, but it was a really cliched post-breakup trip in 2010 where I just flew. I'd had my license for 2 years just for commuting. I'd broken up with my first serious girlfriend and I jumped on a plane to California, reservation for our Eagle Rider Harley Sportster Low, and I spent a week thrashing around California, which just blew my mind out. I still remember now sitting on the flight home, just shaking my head, looking at the photos, thinking, the hell was that? That was incredible. That was my first ever trip, and then over the following 2 or 3 years, I did 2-week trips to Europe on my Triumph Bonneville. I thrashed all the way to Belgrade and back in a 2-week trip, and then similarly with Istanbul as well. And I just got a real kick out of just seeing so much in such a short period of time, and the freedom, the versatility the bike gave to see things in a very unvarnished and real way as well. In January 2015, I spent 4 months riding from Buenos Aires to Lima on the said Bonneville. The plan was to be the first leg of a longer trip. Unfortunately, I had an argument with a Peruvian minibus in the mountains just north of Lima, which was on the wrong side of a hairpin, and unfortunately wrote off the bike. After a failed attempt to try and smuggle in a spare engine from the US with a blueberry import business run by a very charismatic flight attendant from Peruvian Airlines in Lima, which involved basically bribing various customer officials. We decided not to do that at the last moment. I sold the bike on the black market out there, and I've been told it's been rebuilt and is now still going around Lima, which was quite cool.
That's quite an odd choice of motorcycle to go travelling on. Were you not really aware of the kind of adventure motorcycling scene back then?
You know what? No. I met 2 months before, I went in January 15. I was invited by a friend of mine from the adventure travel community, not from the biking community, but from the adventure travel community, a lady called Anna McNuff, who's done lots of really impressive running and cycling adventures. In London, the adventure kind of scene was really quite taking off at this point around 10 years ago. And I met through that Austin. I met Austin Vince. And I remember meeting in a pub, and Anna had met him, I think, and introduced me to him. And I told him I was going to South America on a Bonneville, and his exact words were, "Why are you doing that? That'll be a total bloody folly." In Austin's very direct style. And me being slightly stubborn, I was like, I still persist in what I was doing. Yeah, so at that point, I just wasn't aware of it, Clive. I think for me, I just tend to get in my bubble and do my own things. And it's only sometimes afterwards when I put my head above the parapet.
I thought he might have approved of that, in a way.
No, but it's not lightweight enough, Noel, that's the thing.
Turns out he's right. He crashed into a bus.
No, Clive. The bus crashed into me. Then from there afterwards, I spent a year riding from London to Sydney solo. That was my first adventure into adventure bike community. Whilst I was kind of resting after the crash in Lima, I was with some South African guys, and one of them said, "You should look at a Tenere." He had a copy of Chris's book, actually, thinking now. Had all the different versions of the Tenere in there. The 660Z, so the 2009-10 model, took my eye. I came back to the UK and I managed to get one for quite a cheap price, actually. I think got it for a few grand.
At one point, hadn't Chris, because he tried various bikes, didn't he, in Morocco, and didn't he try that Yamaha in Morocco at one point?
I've seen it on his website. I've never spoken to him about it, but he did.
Did you get that bike after Chris had tried it?
I think so. I do remember in that copy of the Adventure Biking, Motorbike and Hands book, I think there was a picture of it. It was beige.
Yes. That's the one.
So in Peru, we'd spent 2 weeks basically working our way from Cusco back to Lima via the Golden Valley and Machu Picchu. So through what used to be the Shining Path territory, actually terrorist territory a while ago, is now kind of narco territory with this group of us. And we'd done a lot of dirt roads as part of it. I just realised that I wanted something more capable and to get off my beaten track. That was the thing that got me really interested in it. I took the opportunity to re-equip myself with something more capable. I had a couple of months at home. June 2015, I got going. I spent a year riding to Sydney on that, which involved various shenanigans, a broken foot, having to lie to get a Pakistan visa, lie to get a Chinese visa, riding into Pakistan over the Kunjarab Pass, which is the world's highest paved border crossing, 2 weeks before it closed for the winter, and it was just sheet ice and snow. Fortunately, I was detained in the Kazakh police jail at one point, and then also a Chinese one as well, and then finally kind of made it out through Pakistan, India, Southeast Asia, and then Australia, and stumbled across the line. To be honest, absolutely bloody exhausted a year later over Sydney, into Sydney. Probably spent really the first week just eating nothing but cheddar cheese and Cadbury's cream eggs. That was an amazing trip, and it's kind of mind-blowing, I guess. So I did that, and then when I came back to the UK, I started doing a lot more off-roading. And I just fell in with a group of guys and I started doing the green laning. It coincided at the time when green lanes and mapping information become a lot more available through likes of Wikiloc and Outdoor Active and what have you. And I discovered out about a year after I got home that I'd been riding around the Tenerife with a cracked frame. And it was just totaled, like the suspension. It was a decision whether to invest in overhauling it or not. And I decided to sell it, and I sold it on to some guys.
It had been a reliable bike on the trip to Australia?
Yeah, you know what? It had. Yeah, I mean, at that point, I knew nothing really about mechanics. I rode it. I rode it from Georgia to Tbilisi, all the way to as far as Esperance in Australia with a Coke can shimming out the rear wheel bearing. We pulled the back wheel off. Finally, it started to fail just about as I was crossing Nullarbor. And I managed to get out and ride 200 kilometres to Kalgoorlie, that famous mining town. There was a Yamaha shop there, and we pulled the back wheel off and the whole thing just crumbled.
So once you got to Australia, actually riding in Australia was quite a big part of the trip. You rode across Australia.
I had 6 weeks there, which, for Australia is barely enough to touch any of it, especially when you're trying to cover quite a lot of ground. I kept on the surface of the earth as far as Indonesia. It was the most eastern point I went before I had to finally put the bike to freight to Perth because I was running out of time and money. Got a cheap flight to freight it from Kuching in East Malaysia, which is in Borneo, what used to be British Borneo, to Perth, and then spent 6 weeks riding, following the coast, then across the Nullarbor, and then following the coast again round the Great Ocean Road, and then over the Snowies to Sydney, and then another few weeks in New South Wales, which was incredible. And it's incredible riding over there. It's the scale is just mind-blowing. So I started doing more green laning, and then the Tenerife kind of was traded in, and a rebuilt 1983 Tenerife came up. One of the first edition ones came up. It'd been re-engined with a later 2003 engine on eBay. I got that bike and I loved it straight away. And the thing with these 660Z Tenerife, it's a very practical, solid bike. I never found it really set my soul alight. I always found it like it was missing something. Missing some character, I think. But the older Tenerife, you just felt like you're on top of it a lot more. A lot more green laning in, first of all, UK and the Tet. The bike, because it'd been restored to be a bit of a show pony, probably started falling apart because not everything was done up, so I had to deal with that. And I went on a journey, number one, of learning to green lane, but number two, also understanding, and you'll appreciate this, Noel, as someone who has a love of the older bikes, of understanding the need of thinking ahead of the game for your maintenance and understanding, really making sure that you know every bit of that bike that's been replaced and when, and doing a lot more preventative maintenance, knowing exactly what might go wrong next. And that took me a long time to get my head around because I'm not naturally mechanically minded. So I did trips to Europe and that, including Italy. I spent quite a lot of time in Italy and Slovenia doing bits of Tet in Italy, but also further down in central Italy. But if you go down central Italy, north of Aquila, in the Silabini Mountains, there's just some fantastic riding there, long runs, gravel runs, as well as some technical stuff as well.
A lot of us in the UK probably don't want to know how good it is because it is just that little bit out of reach, isn't it? I think most people's time off, you get to the border of Italy and then you look at your watch and it's time to head back, isn't it?
I got my boss in trouble. This was in 2020, in the middle of COVID in the summer, where there was a gap, a window where he could get away. And I just booked 3 weeks off. My boss signed it off, and I don't think he realised, and he got in a whole world of trouble for taking 3 weeks off. So I needed 3 weeks to get down that and get back again. For a variety of reasons, I had to save some money because of work. Didn't get away until then. Work gave me a sabbatical in 2022, and I spent 5 months in Georgia and Armenia.
How did you get so good at doing these mammoth trips? You just drop them in, and then I just did, and each one is just like this, to me, this huge thing that most people would trade on for the rest of their lives as just a single trip. Did you start travelling as a younger man like this?
We'll be right back after this quick ad break.
Hey guys, it's Matt Clausen, your host of the All Automotive Podcast. I've been in the automotive industry for over 30 years. I've owned my own repair shop for the last 15 years. I was going to write a book, but I started this podcast instead. So come join me for my take on vehicle extended service contracts, or what to look for when purchasing a used vehicle. Like and subscribe to the All Automotive Podcast. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
No, I didn't travel at all until I really did the California trip. I think your parents are a big influence on you, aren't you? And my parents met in Africa in the 70s. Mum was an English teacher, Dad was a farming teacher. You just grew up with all these different tales. And I think there was definitely a sense of me reaching 28, 29. I had this interest in the wider world, but I hadn't really capitalised it. So I think, I mean, there were some risks there that I've taken career-wise, I would say. I've been fortunate career-wise. I'm always trying to balance it with what is a very corporate job, ultimately, is corporate affairs. And I'm always mindful of don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg, because ultimately my work is pretty enjoyable. I'm not one of those type of people who travel and rail against the corporate world. I can see it for its shortcomings, don't get me wrong. I mean, you've got to spend 30 seconds on LinkedIn and you see that. But generally my work's quite interesting. I get paid pretty well for doing it. And look, I grew up shoveling grain and shit on a farm for the first 23 years of my life. It's pretty easy, to be honest. Not to sound a bit arrogant, but it's interesting, it's stimulating. Yes, it's challenging, but it's not physically demanding and it's well paid, relatively speaking. I think the balancing those two things, Noel, is in a long way to answering your question is something I've been conscious of. For me, it's just a heart over head thing. The biking, ever since I've started doing it seriously, is what makes me feel alive. Whilst I might be a little bit critical about social media, that definitely has had a role in inspiring that. But as I've got older, I've also been careful about managing more the downsides of that as well. I mean, I think probably the same as a lot of people, I was inspired by, the likes of Borman and McGregor, Ted Simon's book as well. But the guys who inspire me now, to that point, and to your point about where does the motivation come from, the guys who inspire me now are the ones who manage to have a balance of two worlds as well. So Adam Ryman, his stuff, his videos are great. And obviously he's managed to do it as a full-time job, but he also balances it with a family life as well. I think that's great. And I think there's not enough talked about that on social media. I think quite often the image is just given that you do it all or nothing at all. And I think there needs to be more balance there. So those are the guys who are really inspirational for me. Giorgio Armenia actually was inspired by a little bit of a trip around your neck of the woods, Noel. I'd planned to spend winter, 2 weeks in Christmas, New Year in Morocco, but I couldn't because of COVID. So I literally shoved my 92 XT in the back of the van. I drove to Dales, stayed in my sister-in-law's rental place in Lowrow and spent a week just riding there. And I wrote this whole piece about Through or Around, which is the value of just focusing on an area and exploring it rather than just focusing on an end destination. And that inspired Georgia and Armenia, where it was a case of get there and just spend time exploring everything I could in those areas. That was sabbatical. I came back and did the job after a year of that. I decided to move from the organisation. And where the risk I took at that point was, okay, I want to do another trip, but I'm going to have to take a risk here. I had some money saved up for the trip, but I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to go and do another trip. The final big trip I did was a year ago, was 2 to 3 months in Algeria, riding down in the Central Sahara down there and really kind of chucking myself in desert riding on another level, which I hadn't done before.
And was that the first time you'd ever been to that part of the world?
For Algeria, yeah. I mean, Algeria's been closed to only independent travel for 20 years. You need a guide or an escort to get in. I decided to give it a go to see if I could get in without a guide. Just have that freedom to explore, and to my surprise, I did. I managed to get around on my own, some of the old Dakar pistes, but also just exploring places like the Ahogha Mountains, which is these stunning kind of Mars-like landscapes, and just really kind of moved things up a level. So the longest piste I did was for 60 kilometres, so 270 miles, just through the Tifades Mountains, in the northern Ahogha. And that was about finding a new challenge and challenging myself in new ways. Scared myself shitless, because distances, it's kind of, Morocco's big. Algeria is on another level, I would say, because there's just no infrastructure there to support you. And indeed, I spent half the time wondering whether I was even allowed to be where I was. The tricky thing with those kind of distances and ranges that you do is that you start going into anything like heavy sand and you start burning a lot more fuel. So, and then anything that sets you back time-wise, say a puncture, then you eat into reserves of water and food and so on. My understanding is it's very patchy over there at the moment. Some people have made it in around there, but then they've been put under escort or they've been told they can't go places. For some reason, for 2 months, I managed to just get around on my own and do what I wanted, basically. There were a few kind of half-truths told along the way, as it has to be on the road sometimes. I had to manage the police, as it were, but it seemed to work out all right.
Where did you get the knowledge of Morocco from? You must have spent a lot of time there.
Well, Morocco, simply because it's there and because of Sahara and the fact that you've got somewhere which is so different on the doorstep of Europe. If you can get down that far, it's relatively accessible. And that idea of doing that kind of riding with bigger distances is really kind of something in Morocco. So I got a taste for the desert riding stuff in Morocco. The attraction of Algeria, briefly speaking, was number one, to be one of the first people to get in there unassisted and to have the opportunity to explore the Ahogha with these, and the Sahara, Central Sahara, with these amazing landscapes. And I got that actually in part from Chris's book, Chris's Desert Travels book, I think it's called, or Desert Biking, whatever it is called, where he gives his tales from the 80s, really kind of was like, I want a piece of that action, because it's on just another scale. But that also applies to Morocco, right, as well? Because Morocco, you have these huge, beautiful landscapes, almost otherworldly landscapes as well, which are so different from what we have in Europe. You've got it all. You've got a mix. You've got the Atlas, obviously, and then you have the areas in the Sahara as well. And culturally, it just feels night and day, doesn't it, to Europe? And that's what the TMT is about, I guess. I always say one of the strengths and weaknesses of social media and smartphones is we have a lot more information, but it doesn't mean we will have access to quality information. I think sorting the wheat from the chaff is now actually harder than ever because we've got to do it ourselves rather than relying on someone else to do it. You can see that when you look on Wikiloc, for example, which is a fantastic app. It's one of the few online apps that I would argue that hasn't gone south after it's been monetized. A lot of them other ones have, and it stayed really good. But the thing with Wikiloc is you have thousands of different routes on there. You're like, well, where do I start with this stuff? If you've managed to balance your responsibilities with your family and work life to get 2 weeks off, then going out and planning and doing all the research is another whole job, but you might not have time to do that. So the TMT is about sorting the wheat from the chaff in that respect. I would say the other thing with it as well is, for all the longer adventures that I've done and, certainly longer adventures that Chris has done, there's no critical mass of days I think you need to have an adventure, right? When I think about the episodes and the big adventures I've done, quite often the episodes are maybe 2 or 3 days long within part of a bigger trip. I've also had 2 episodes of 2 or 3 days long within a week or a 3 week or even a long weekend trip before as well. It's about kind of increasing that accessibility in that sense of what adventure could be, and Morocco offers it all for reasons that I say.
Noel can often be quite critical about following a line on a sat-nav. What the effect of the TET has done, and of course the effect that the Trans-Morocco Trail will have undoubtedly as well, is it just opens up places to people. It makes it easy to get there. So you don't have to do that months of planning, or you don't have to have months to do the trip. You can basically just go to these amazing places and experience them in a 7-day holiday, effectively.
It's easier now to do things like leave bikes there as well than it used to be. And we've got information about that on the website for the leaving your bike there. Indeed, what I'm doing when I get on the boat I have 2 weeks off from Sunday. I'm going down to scout the northern section of a route. We've launched the southern 2/3 of it, if you were, already, but I'm going to scout the northern section from the Med Coast down to Mazuga, which is in the Sahara, to that hinterland. What I'm planning to do, which is a model which some listeners might think about, is I take the bike down there, I'm riding down there, admittedly, but then I'm storing it in southern Spain for 6 months. You can keep your bike in the EU for 6 months as a Brit. And I'm storing it in Malaga, where flights, I'm fortunate enough to live in the south, I'm fortunate enough to live in London, I'm only 25 minutes from Heathrow.
Fortunate?
Fortunate in some ways, not in others. I may have been down here 20 years, Clive, I'm still a proud northerner. But I can fly in and out of Malaga for like 60 quid return. And my bike's already in Spain. If you were really savvy, you could keep your bike in somewhere like Tarifa or near Algeciras. And it's an hour and a half, 2 hours, I think it is, on the ferry over to Morocco. So suddenly you're talking about doing that week-long trip. Morocco, you can do it if you get the logistics right. So this is about, as you say, easing the logistics to some extent.
So tell us, what is the Trans-Morocco Trail?
It's not a network like the Trans-Euro Trail. It's more of a singular route. When it's finally completed, it will stretch from Nador, which is opposite Spain on the Med Coast. It will then go across what is called the Moroccan Empty Quarter, the Rakan Plateau, which is this very desolate, but in my view, quite beautiful hinterland just north of the Sahara. So it's very flat with canyons and forts and what have you. And then goes down to Mazuga, where the famous dunes are in the Sahara. And then it cuts it up over the Atlas Mountains and works its way south over the Atlas to eventually down to TAMP on the Atlantic coast. So it's 3,000 kilometers long. It's a singular trail that you can download off our website. We've initially done it in a Google Maps format, what's called a KML format, because then you can see things like fuel and accommodation and so on. But that can be very easily converted to a GPX format that many of your listeners will be very familiar with. You can actually run it automatically without converting it in things like Gaia GPS and I believe Osmand. That's very much what it's about, I guess.
Yeah, the KML file format is really important because what it does allow you to do is to put a lot of markers on the route for things like petrol stations, places to stay, whether they're hotels or auberges or, some things are a little bit more rudimental. I think there are places to eat as well on there. So that makes the whole trip an awful lot easier, because sometimes Morocco, you stop somewhere and you'll be looking around thinking, why have we stopped here? And then that mud wall just over there, that's where the restaurant is. You probably wouldn't spot it unless you knew it was there, right?
Particularly things like petrol as well, where if you're buying it out of a can and that sort of stuff. And also because the distances are so much greater than we have in Europe, you need to be thinking further ahead in things like fuel and what have you, and mechanics and that side of things.
How was the idea born, and how did you meet one of my all-time heroes, Chris Scott?
It's Chris's idea originally. Chris and I had been in touch since 2019 when I'd read Desert Travels. We corresponded on Hub, and I just started asking questions about Algeria. At that point, it was like not really possible to go there. It still technically isn't, I don't think. We kept in touch. I ended up contributing to one of the editions of Adventure Motorbike Handbook, some photos, nothing written. And then I was in touch with him again about the trip that I did to Algeria this time last year. We compared notes, and he provided one or two tidbits of information from back in the day. So we kept in touch, and then he sent me an email, I think earlier on this year, saying, "What do you do for a living?" which was a slightly random email. I said, "Well, I work in comms and public affairs." And blah, blah, blah. Naturally, his next question was, "What the hell's that?" Which is fair enough, because I think it's not the most straightforward job. And I said, "Why do you ask?" He said, "Well, I've had this idea, but to be honest, I don't really want to do it on my own. I want to work with someone who has a similar interest in it. Are you up for it?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm happy to kind of get stuck in." And we went from there. And actually, Chris has got a huge amount of knowledge because he runs guided tours out there. He writes a Morocco overland book. And I got stuck in because I was kind of like, as I said before, I'm not going to be doing any longer adventures for a few years at least. I wanted a bit of a project to get involved in as well. So I took responsibility setting up the website, which you may have seen, and then also on the Facebook side of things. Chris also had information from his Morocco overland books transposed into the southern 2/3 of the route. And I had done the northeastern part of the route early on last year, and he hadn't done that section before, or not recently, certainly. I've taken on responsibility for scouting that first 600 kilometres of the route. So that's how we divided responsibilities. And
I don't think, Noel, I've ever told you the Chris Scott TAMP podcast story, have I?
Oh my God. I mean, don't get him on, because he's one person I will be scared stiff to talk to, because we don't talk about Chris Scott enough on this podcast.
We should.
And we don't talk about the Adventure Motorcycling Handbook enough. This was a book that was by my bed for like 5 years. I would just read it over and pore over the images. This is before I'd kind of travelled or even got back into biking seriously. And it was just the most incredibly inspirational read. It was just a fantastic book.
So the Adventure Motorcycling Handbook was written 33 years ago and first published in 1991, and it's now in its 8th edition, and it is the Bible of adventure motorcycle travelling.
I carried it with me in South America, London to Sydney. I think I've still got my very beaten up copy of it somewhere. I think it kind of ended up glued together by some UHT milk and oil mixture that exploded in a bag somewhere.
So really early on in the podcast, Noel, I can't remember what it was, but he gave some level of encouragement. It might have just been a like or a comment on a post, and I'm thinking, it's fucking Chris Scott.
Yeah.
Has just done this, whatever it was. Can't remember what it was. I was cool. I left it for a week or so and then messaged him, said, "Do you fancy coming on the podcast and chatting on the podcast?" And he very, very politely said no thanks. That it wasn't for him.
I like that about him, because he is kind of like this elusive sort of SAS-like character, isn't he? I want him to stay like that.
I can't even believe he's human. He's like a myth, a legend. Will-o'-the-wisp. It's a human being that leads tours, right?
He must know Morocco like the back of his hand now.
He does it in month blocks. He's over there now, and then I think he's over there in January or something.
I got very excited about the route because I was looking at the route earlier and I saw that it currently starts at Mazouga. So you've got the massive cathedral dune of Erg Shebi. There's a few beautiful hotels kind of overlooking the sand dunes, and you can have a sleep in a Berber tent and all that kind of great stuff. But you can also, you can just go and ride on the sand dunes, can't you? You can go ride round. And
there's a Tenere cafe there with the right font. It says Tenere in the right font as well.
I'm not sure that was there when I went there, actually, to be honest. I actually that's when I broke my shoulder, so I didn't actually get to...
Did you what, doing the dunes?
No, I broke my shoulder before we got to Mazouga, sadly. So I missed out on riding the dunes.
Whereabouts?
Oh, not far out of Ouarzazate. Flew into Marrakesh, over the Atlas in a bus, and then, rode from Ouarzazate. But I think I've told that story on here.
Do you have to fly home then?
Please don't make him tell the story again.
It wasn't broken, it's just the tendon got ripped off the end of the collarbone, so it was painful. I'd sold like an amplifier, guitar amplifier, to afford the trip, so I wasn't going to miss it. I just kind of got a sling. And there was a guy who was kind of learning the route, and he had an ex-Dakar race truck. So I spent the rest of the week in that, which you think would be really quite cool, but it wasn't because it had no seatbelts in it. So every time the truck was bouncing along on the pistes, my arm was absolutely killing me.
The good news is, in my experience, you can get some really strong ibuprofen in Morocco. There's none of this 200 milligram nonsense we have in the UK.
All other countries seem to have much better ibuprofen than we've got. We seem to get the mild stuff. Everyone else has got the good stuff.
So the other highlight for me on your route was a place called Foumzagid. we stayed in this very basic guest house, which is really, they just gave us a blanket and we slept on the floor. And there was pretty much no running water. So to wash, they took us down to the local hammam, which is like a bathhouse. And it was literally 3 rooms. Actually, I thought it was 2 rooms. And the third room has like troughs of water that are heated underneath by fire, wood-burning fires to give you the hot water to wash in. It's completely dark. So anyway, we got there. There was about 8 of us got there. There's all these little kids just hanging around, staring at us. And I'm thinking, oh, well, you've got to get changed somewhere. So I basically stripped off. And it turned out you should have actually changed in the next room. And then you enter this just complete pitch blackness. So you can't see. You stumble around and find these ladles to spoon hot water all over you. So that was quite a good experience.
Horrible image, that is.
There's a huge amount to see in the country as well. I think until you go there, it's difficult to appreciate, isn't it? Just how much there is to see. And it's not surprising when you particularly see the grey nomads and whatever, who have spent months on end there, just in Morocco. There's so much that I would like to go and see further south, which I haven't done actually, which is on the TMT route. Which is, why we divided it. I've taken the northern section because, to be honest, I haven't done that much in the south.
This podcast has a history of encouraging people to go to Morocco because I absolutely love it out there. But it is a complete change. It is such a contrast to Europe. You're in Africa, you're in Arabic Africa, and it is a real, everything you see in the films, it's there. There are cobras in the square in Marrakesh. It is deserts for miles. You can ride literally for 12, 13 hours and not see any sign of habitation. It is unbelievable. I don't know how you prepare yourself for it.
I don't think it can. I think it's always a culture shock.
It takes a while to adjust, doesn't it? It's a huge culture shock. It takes a few days to adjust to it. But equally, I find it takes a few days to adjust back to a Northern European culture when you come home. The grumpy, dangerous world of Northern Europe. After the lovely, smiley, happy world of Morocco, really.
Yes, when I was last there, I came home via Marrakesh. There's a Paul, the posh bakery, Paul Bakeries. There's one on the outskirts of Marrakesh somewhere. I'd slept at a campsite and arrived so late, I just slept on the ground, even bothered pitching a tent. The next morning, I went to a Paul Bakery and I think at that point, I was ready to eat anything, to be honest. It's that kind of sense of getting somewhere so totally different that is, relatively speaking, accessible. You can go far further places, far further afield in the world and not have that same difference, I guess.
The other thing with Morocco, it is pretty damn friendly. You can buy beer in bars and hotels. That's not an issue, even though it is a Muslim country. The language is Moroccan Arabic, but a lot of people will speak French as well. So that helps you to get through if you speak a little bit of French as well. So like I say, not only is it geographically accessible, but it is very accessible to Westerners as well. People are very welcoming, right?
And crucially, there's infrastructure and attitudes there in relation to tourism, which you don't necessarily get in other countries. And I'm thinking here actually in comparison to Algeria. I don't mean that in that you get cosseted. You know what I mean? I don't mean that at all. What I mean is, if you have a 2-week window to do a trip, you don't have half a day to try and find a hotel which is potentially hundreds of kilometres away because there's no tourist infrastructure. You know what I mean? I mean, you can do that if you want. But the further you go away from that kind of infrastructure, there's an increased amount of faffage, and there's a balance between faffage and adventure, right? We all want to do adventure. We all accept that you take on board what happens, what, comes along or comes what may be. But there gets a point where if you're not getting to do what you do most, which is riding a bike, exploring, and you're spending more time going from hotel to hotel or trying to find a hotel or trying to find petrol and not really seeing and doing that, then it becomes very frustrating. In Morocco, you've got, on the one hand, you do have a bit more infrastructure there. One example would be, if you need to find a hotel, you can find something on booking.com, if you've got mobile phone reception, which is not always the case in other countries, for example. So there's that familiarity with tourism and having the infrastructure there. But at the same time, like I say, it's far more of an adventure than, say, being in Europe, where everything is kind of available to you on a platter, to be honest, perhaps with the exception of Southeastern Europe and the Balkans and perhaps one or two other places. It's a good balance, I think.
Come back to the route for a minute. I had to look on Google Earth today, Google Maps or whatever it's called, and a lot of it does seem to be piste. Inevitably, there'll be some tarmac, but what percentage is tarmac versus piste? Piste is basically a dirt track through the desert. I'm not sure why they're called piste. French, that's probably why they're...
It comes from the skiing thing, I think. I'd have to check that, actually, if I'm going to be completely honest. I mean, I think it might be about 40% on road. I might be wrong about that.
You're going to get asked that question an awful lot, I imagine.
Yeah.
Buckle up.
And can I take my BMW which tows a caravan? That's another one.
If you've got the capability to ride out on rough territory, go for it. But you've got to make that judgment.
You talked earlier about, maybe before we pressed the record button, about managing expectations. I thought that was very interesting, because that's going to be a huge part of it.
I wanted to talk about this, Ed, because I was looking at your website today and I really liked your hierarchy of needs. So those of us that work in the corporate world, or psychologists or whatever.
I'm shaking my head at myself at this point.
I really liked it. I'll shake my head at myself later on. There's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is basically to be fulfilled as human beings, we need the physiological things, which is food, water, whatever. We need some safety. We need some self-actualization. We need self-esteem, and we need love and belonging. But you've actually turned that into an adventurous Where Next Barney's hierarchy of needs. Tell us about that.
I did a couple of speaking slots at the Adventure Bike Rider Festival in July, I think it was. I had this idea forming when actually I was in Algeria, and I was thinking about how I really enjoy managing risk, managing all the different logistics around what I need to do to get to do what I do in that responsibility, and how I organise it in my mind. And I thought there's something interesting that I wanted to write. I think there were 2 or 3 reflections related to that and how it applies to the TMT. And the first reflection is to get to the point where you learn to balance all that stuff is an individual process, right? Different people learn at different paces. Different people have different starting points. Some people, I think of my mate Charlie.
Not that one.
Rode mountain bikes in the year dot, fearless on a motorbike off-road as a result. Now, I will put my hands up and say I am cack-handed, mal-coordinated, and whilst I've done some pretty risky stuff on my bike, whatever skill I have has been learned by just practicing a lot, and falling off a lot. And actually going on that journey and learning of that and learning by doing. And that's me. Not everyone's like that. So to get to that point where you learn to balance responsibilities, you do have to go on your own journey. And I think there's a lot of people, particularly on social media, who say, oh, well, you do it this way, or no, you do it this way, or you do it this way. My advice to any listeners who are thinking about this and thinking, I want to do a TMT, I'm not sure I've got the capability, read around. Start with understanding what skills and capabilities you think you will need and what to do the job, and then formulate what's the best approach for you from there. What advice people give is on this sort of stuff is often what is right for them. When it came to the kind of articulating that and the kind of hierarchy of needs, I wanted to write something which wasn't prescriptive, you know what I mean? It was just kind of like, these are things you should think about, or what I suggest that you think about based on my experience, and how you manage these risks accordingly. Particularly when you start to do riding in deserts and longer distance, for example, you need to think about different capabilities and what are enablers and their interdependencies. So the classic one is, if you do want to travel longer distances on your bike, further into desert, you have to carry more fuel and more water. That means that the bike is heavier, which means that on deeper sand, for example, in Hueds, for example, where it's deeper and it might be trickier and you can't get on a foot pegs for whatever reason, and you end up paddling, you end up burning more fuel. And the bike becomes tricky, so you don't get to do the longer distance as a result. And how do you balance all those different things? So that's the kind of thinking behind that post. And we shared it on the TMT Facebook group, which, by the way, I recommend looking at. We've got up to, I think, 3,500 members in the last couple of months. So it's become a little bit popular quite quickly, I think. And this idea of personal responsibility is, there was a quote on a website, and I can't remember exactly, but Chris wrote it. You go in the attitude of something else might happen, this might happen, or World War III might happen, whatever. It's called adventure motorbiking for a reason. And what we want to be careful with the TMT is because the distances are bigger than we have in Europe. And because the infrastructure, whilst it's, as I was saying before, whilst it might be more developed than some other countries, it's not perhaps as developed as it is in Europe. You need to be thinking about and doing your own research about what you're doing. And the way I would describe it is the TMT is not a wardrobe that's already been built. If you're buying a wardrobe, it's not a wardrobe that's already been built. It's an IKEA flat pack kit. That's the best way to look at it. You're going to buy that flat pack kit. You've got to have the right tools to do the job. It's your job to make sure you've got the right tools, and you have to assemble it.
If you're not good at DIY, don't buy it.
Or if you want to get good at DIY, take the time to get DIY and then do it. If you wanted to build a wardrobe and you're awful at carpentry, you wouldn't try and build it from scratch necessarily, would you? The TMT is trying to fill that space in the middle, is the best way to describe it.
And there is inherently more risk because of where you are. we always talk about riding in Europe. You know, you're probably only going to be half an hour from the nearest town or the nearest phone or the nearest ambulance. Whereas in Morocco, I mean, my stupid accident there, I was 4 hours away from the nearest hospital. I don't even want to talk about something else that we saw, but somebody just crashed somewhere else on another trip. And I don't think that person made it, because you just don't have access to the facilities that we're used to in Europe. So you do have to consider what you're doing and think about it and make some decisions and be kitted out sensibly so you can survive in a negative situation, right?
In the past, in the 80s and 90s, there was this golden era of Saharan travel, right? And it kind of went quiet because of, security issues and whatever else in the 2000s to some extent in the Sahel. I think a lot of knowledge has been lost, and also things like the fact that the Paris-Dakar doesn't go on the Paris-Dakar route anymore, it goes off elsewhere. I get the feeling that if you rewind 20, 25 years ago and beyond and further back, you had a lot more people travelling into places like Morocco, Algeria, perhaps Libya and in Egypt doing desert travel. And that's all gone by the wayside now, which means there's a lot less knowledge out there. And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking about one of the other Chris's books that he's written, is Sahara Overland, which now you can only buy in used format from Amazon, which was invaluable for me, certainly, when I started doing more desert riding. But I had to know that existed. I don't think there's any book out there that I'm aware of that describes what you need to do quite so clearly. You need to think about all those things, it's like you're saying, and you need to go away and do some research and also apply a bit of common sense, but also just think about, there's no problem taking any risks, from an ethical point of view, so long as you've engaged and recognised that there are the risks and decided to mitigate them best you can and then still decide to take the risks.
With motorcycling, we know there are risks, but what you don't want to do is turn those risks into dangers. If you mitigate the risk, you reduce the risk of danger.
And there will always be some residual risk, right? Particularly if you're doing it solo. I'm daft enough to do most of my stuff solo. And the attitude I've taken is mitigate risk as much as possible, and then what the residual risk is happening, do I want to take that? And usually that comes down to a decision of, where does my ambition lie? Is this what I want to get out of my travel? Can I justify to myself that risk that I've taken as a result and the consequences of that?
Do you enjoy solo trips a lot more than riding with other people? Have you ridden with other people much?
I've ridden a bit with other people. I was lucky enough to fall in with a group of guys who call ourselves the Muddy Buggers. The value of riding in a group is that when you're learning a new skill is that you will take more risks. You will challenge yourself a little bit more. A, because you're aware that someone's there to help you, and B, probably, you get a little bit competitive perhaps, and you want to make sure you keep up with people, so you push yourself more. And C, also, because if you ride solo, you're conscious that you're own, and therefore you hold yourself back. So I've done some riding in groups, and that's been great, and I've got a huge amount from that. But I do tend to prefer to do stuff solo. I like the freedom of it. I love the freedom of being able to go and do that, having that ability to explore.
I noticed on a recent trip away with people that I think I set off early one morning. Everyone, I can't remember why, but anyway, I was ready.
It's because you're an antisocial bastard, that's why.
That was it, because it was raining, and I thought, I don't want to stand around in the rain. I'll just ride on, and we'll meet at the first coffee stop. But I noticed that I was riding. I'd kind of been clocking the speed that we'd been riding at. And this is a very conservative, nice group to ride with. But I was riding on my own a good 15 to 20 miles an hour slower on the tracks on my own. That was my default speed. But I remember it was a good 20 miles an hour slower on my own.
You're always thinking to yourself, aren't you, how am I going to get out of this situation if I'm on my own as well? And it's possible to think creative around it. So for example, and this applies to Morocco as well, and I'll do it for when I go there to scout the Recam route this next 2 weeks. When I was in Algeria last year, I had a Microsoft Word document, and it was a set of protocols. And I carried a GPS tag, one of the spot tackers. I've just upgraded to a Garmin, actually. Not that I'm being paid, by the way, and not plugging in for that reason. I had one of these Spot 3 things, which was a one-way messenger. And the agreement I had, it sent an SMS to my girlfriend by 8 o'clock each evening, check-in message to let her I was okay. If she didn't get that, she had instructions on what to do in terms of any contacts that I made in country, I would share there ahead of time. She had my route ahead of time. She had a tracking link so you see my location every 5 minutes. For that example of how to try and mitigate risk of those protocols, in that Google document, I had a link to GPX route that I was riding for that stint as well for a few days, a few days, whatever. I'd have my estimated time of finish. As I said, she'd have a tracking link to see where I was. I'd have contact details in country, and then also I had fortunate enough to have a friend or two working in the Foreign Office who was happy to look out for me if need be. I was fortunate for that position. I also paid, at this point, Spot 3 had quite a bargain deal for search and rescue insurance for 30 quid that I paid for as well. Yeah, we have these romantic images of a solo figure driving through the desert with a plume of sand behind you. But actually, there are mitigations that you can do, which are, when you do them, you're like, well, why haven't I done this before? This is a no-brainer. I myself have been quite macho in it in the past because, well, not macho, but romantic in the past about this ideal of traveling a golden age and, just going off on it. The reality is that if you do have responsibilities back home and you do have responsibility things other than yourself, which ultimately most of us do, it is possible to think practically about the mitigations you put there to address the risks that we've been talking about.
Funny you mentioned that. I got chatting to a guy on Sunday. I went for a ride out on Sunday, and he was talking about who did you use for insurance when you were travelling on the TET in Spain, and I went, do you know what? I think the last couple of times I've not bothered.
I think there are specialist providers out there.
There are specialist providers, and he then went on to tell me about 3 horror stories of people having to remortgage and things like that to pay huge bills for hospitals and recoveries and things like that.
I've got to admit, I probably should do it, which reminds me, I probably should do it before I go to Morocco in a few days' time.
Knowing some of the areas a little bit that I can see on the route, are you using any old Dakar pistes? It looks like you might be.
Yes, I think there are. I think we are missing out on these Mizugo Zagora piste, unfortunately, which I think is probably one of the most famous ones. We cut up into the Atlas for that. But there are, I think, later on in some of those pistes. I'd have to check to see whether the northern route through the Recam was ever on the Dakar. I'm not sure if it was. I think it might have been.
What's the biggest distance between fuel?
Generally speaking, we've put fuel stops in there within a couple 300 kilometres.
I'm getting a bunch of my real mates together. Noel's not coming because he doesn't like following lines on maps.
I don't know where you get this. What's the line thing?
Got it recorded and written down somewhere. I'll prove it if I have to.
This is another thing that I have no recollection of ever saying.
You're just saying that because Ed's here now and it's his idea. You're embarrassed.
Joking aside, it's a really interesting philosophical debate. For me anyway, maybe I'm just boring, but I find it really interesting, the philosophical debate about that. We've done this route and I can see the value of following lines, but also I've done trips where I've proactively avoided that. After I did London to Sydney, one of the things that I felt was just constantly chasing a destination was I felt like I risked missing out stuff on the way. That's what you've got to be careful of, including if you do the TMT. Do it, but don't be blinkered. Take a look around, have a look around. Most people will probably do this anyway, but I'm saying this because I know if I follow a line on a map, I can be too blinkered and I can get to the end of it. If I'm not careful, I can feel a little bit hollow as a result.
I think Clive's confusion, if I can speak on behalf of Clive, which I love to do.
I'll just edit it out, don't worry.
And this is what I really like about what you've said about this project, is that it's a route and it isn't a convoluted, this is my sort of beef with the TET in a way, that it has become this convoluted.
So you're admitting it then? You do have a beef with following a line?
Yeah, well, I've worked out where the confusion is, because I don't like the TET when it does kind of a horseshoe that you'll spend all day and you'll pretty much end up where you started that morning. And I'm encouraging people to zoom out a little bit and work out, do they want to do that loop and end up pretty much just down the road from where they set off at breakfast time? Or do they want to make progress across a landscape and across a country? And so the idea that you've just done a circuit really appeals to me, and we're not just meandering and coming back to where we started again.
All right, I'll let you off. I agree with that.
That's what it is, really.
It's a big difference between the TMT and the TET. I think Chris and I did have a conversation at some point about whether it might spread its tentacles somewhat like the TET has done.
Don't do it. Keep it pure.
To be honest, we're doing this as a bit of a side hustle and going with the flow with it a little bit. I don't think there's any plans to do that. I think we've been asked, actually, will we do that at some point?
So I am going with a few mates. Noel's, I might let him come. We've got a couple of weeks. Where should we go? Where should we start? Which bit should we do? Because we're not going to be able to do all of it.
Are you flying into Marrakesh? Or?
Hell no, I'm riding all the way down.
Are you?
Yeah.
Not really.
For me, I think one of the most underrated sections of Morocco is the first part that I'm going to go and scout, which is the Recam Plateau and the Empty Quarter. And I think what I love about that, you come off the coast, in this case, Nador. The route will bring us off Nador. You come over the mountains off the edge of the Rif, and then you come into the Recam. The sense of scale and size there of the landscape, it's a lot of it is kind of dead flat, and you have these series of big canyons and gorges in various places. And the thing that I love about that is it just gives you this instant sense of scale. And yeah, okay, you might not have the soaring kind of peaks of the Atlas and what have you. You might not have the golden dunes of Ochebi and what have you. But it has a value in its own right, I feel, in terms of just giving you a real sense of the scale of the size of the place. So I would say this, and I would say it because I'm going out. This is my section of the TMT that I'll be scouting. Don't skip the first section as you come down from the Med for the first, 600 kilometres or so. It'll be down to Mazuga. I think the section then around the Dades Gorge is always incredibly beautiful. As you eventually come on to other great areas, I think, around it. If you're a film buff, there's Garamador, where they built film Spectre. for James Bond. I don't know if you remember that. And also SAS Rogue Heroes, if you're a fan of that. I don't know if you remember, they're in a big kind of horseshoe-shaped fort. That's the Garamador. That's northwest, I think, of Mazuga. That's a stunning location. So when you come down to that area, when you come into the run into Mazuga, you have this kind of hinterland, which is gradually getting sandy. You get that feel of coming to Sahara. There's some great scenery as well, looking west over the Algerian borders to Kazur Mountains, which are incredibly beautiful and dramatic. But you have to be a little bit careful because you're near the border. You have the Dades Gorge, as I say, you've actually come into that section, and then you're into the Atlas proper, further south. So it depends how much time you have, I guess, to some extent. If you're going to come in from the Med, I would say for the first time you do it, it's worth doing that first section. It's also a good way of kind of getting into the swing of things as well. And en route, if you wanted to go off to TMT, you can stop at places like Chefchaouen, for example, or Tétouan, Chefchaouen's the famous blue city you see, which is quite beautiful to see as well. There's some sections. I mean, if you wanted to fly into Morocco and Marrakesh, which I know you're not doing, but if you did want to fly into Marrakesh, coming over the Atlas down towards eventually Mazuga is always a good stretch to do as well. But then the further south you get, the more remote the runs get. I think there's more kind of piste as you get further south.
It's probably worth saying that there are quite a few companies in Morocco that you can just hire motorcycles from as well.
We've put information about that on the website for that reason as well.
Tell us what the website is, Ed.
It's www.transmoroccotrail.org. There is also a Facebook group, which just search for Trans-Morocco Trail on Facebook and it will come up. And you can join that very easily. We've already got guys out there. In fact, there's guys out there riding it now before I've even ridden certain sections of it myself as a co-founder. And there's guys out there posting it at the moment. At the moment, we do need to be a bit careful. There's been a lot of rain out there in Morocco, as you will have seen in the news. I'm slightly wary so I'm going to be slightly cautious next week when I'm out there.
I was going to say, Ed, whatever you do, don't start a Facebook group for this thing. And now I realise I'm too late.
We have, but I tell you what we've done, and I think I know why you're saying this. We give pretty short shift to kind of a lot of some certain questions, shall we say. We're only at 3,500 members on it, but it seems to be going all right so far. I'm not sure when the questions will start about what engine oil we should have and what tyres we should have.
I think it's a brilliant addition to adventure motorcycling, and you should both be massively applauded for doing it.
Thank you.
It's exciting, isn't it, Clive? Just talking about it.
It really is.
Empty quarters, crikey.
Rekam Plateau, Nador to Mazuga. Oh, names to conjure with.
I took Chris's book with me years ago, and I went with my girlfriend in 2012, and I took that book with me. I was a little bit frustrated that I didn't get to do a lot when I was there, but I found it a little bit outfacing because it's full of map references, isn't it? Grid references, and it was for somebody who was just traveling with a little Garmin 60 CS, it was a little bit hard to transpose the book into the thing. The only bit I did do from it was it was almost like a riverbed from the Todra Gorge to the Dades Gorge, and that was what I thought was going to be just an hour's ride. Took 6 hours, and I got back after the sun had set. Nobody was worried about me, but it took a lot longer than I thought it would, but it was very exciting.
Riverbeds are always one to watch out for because that just tends to be where some of the trickiest fresh tends to be as well, that slippery sand.
And that's where I came across, because there'd been a flash flood which then dried and there was a massive crack in the ground which I managed to put my front wheel in.
Sometimes, particularly if you're relatively new to it, getting your speed up is quite difficult. And if you don't get your speed up, you end up paddling everywhere, and then you can go down so easily as a result and get pinned.
What bike are you scouting on?
Scouting on my XT600.
Oh, yeah.
So it's an 83X3600 XT600, but it's been upgraded. So it's got a 2002 XT600 engine, upgraded the rear drum to disc brake, it's got the later XT suspension, got a wheelbase shock on it, and to be honest, it's a little bit like Trigger's Broom.
There you go. Told you it was good, didn't I? As you know, on this podcast, we are big fans of Morocco, and we really recommend that you get yourself out there by hook or by crook. Trans-Morocco Trail is a fantastic free resource that will actually enable you to do that. But if you're not ready to chuck it all in, there's plenty of companies out there that will ease you in to Morocco. Companies like the one my friend Sam runs called Wilderness Wheels. I know a few of the guys that listen to this podcast have been out with Sam already and rate the trip, the company and Morocco very, very highly. So give Sam a call at Wilderness Wheels and I am sure you'll have an amazing time. One more thing, we are currently finalising this year's Dakar evenings with Lel and Break magazine. There's going to be one in London at the Bike Shed after Christmas and before New Year, and then there's going to be one after the race up north somewhere. We're trying to find a venue in Manchester that will be suitable. If you do know anywhere that would be good for us, give us a shout and let us know, either on Instagram or Facebook. All right, I think that's it. See you next. Thanks for listening. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you really appreciate what we do, you could consider supporting us on Patreon or buy us a coffee. Links are available on our website, which is tampodcast.com, tampodcast.com, where we also have a limited selection of branded stuff. But either way, please keep listening and spreading the word. See you next time.